Good morning,
okay.
ladies and gentlemen.
Afterwards,
I will try to start on
I'll say it for a
time because
coincidence.
some of our speakers have to leave on time also to catch their flights. We have, I think, a very interesting discussion to have because it's a very good following of the last plenary. The last plenary, the conclusion was that we need good information, we need citizen engagement, and we need visionary leadership. But I think we need something else also. We need some tools and frameworks within the government machinery so that these well-being indicators are really used, they are really put in practices. This requires some changes, I think, in the way policies are shaped, monitored, and evaluated. So what we will present to you and discuss with you this morning, it's a couple of examples of how governments are trying to really make these indicators policy relevant and what type of processes, mechanisms are set up within the government machinery so that these indicators do have an impact on policies. We will begin with a presentation by Yuval Laster, who is Director of the Environmental Policy Division at the Ministry of Environment in Israel. Yuval has been championing the use of sustainability indicators and well-being indicators, as well as the use of behavioral economics. Before joining the ministry, he provided private environmental and legal consulting services, and he headed something that sounds very interesting, but I don't know what it is really. It's like the Environmental Law Clinic at the Hebrew University. So Yuval, you will tell us what you have done or what you are currently trying to do to make these well-being indicators policy relevant, and what type of processes you are using within the government, not only in the environmental ministry, if I well understood, and what has been the impact of these processes?
Okay. So thank you, Matilda, for a kind note of introduction. And I want to thank the organizing for having me here and speaking in front of you. If you can put on the presentation. Yeah. So I was asked to present to you how to make well-being measure policy relevant at the national level. And this is based on the experience we had in Israel for the past 3 years since we initiated the well-being process. So we had two objectives of this process from the start. The first, which is a quite common objective, is to provide citizens a comprehensive report on the status of their well-being and a reference for comparison. But the second, which is a bit more unique, was that we put an emphasis on providing the government a comprehensive status report for retrospective analysis, policy formulation, that is based on data and information. So this was our two objectives, and we put a big emphasis on the second one. This was articulated in the government resolution that we passed when we launched the process, and it says clearly that these indicators will be a basis for policy making. So the question that we had was, how do you make well-being measurement policy relevant at the national level? So I thought about this question while traveling here to Guadalajara. We had a long flight, and I came to an interesting answer. You go and do sports. So sports is the acronym of 6 elements that are relevant in order to us to achieve well-being indicators as something that affects policymaking. So first, I'll start with stakeholders. So you need to identify relevant stakeholders for this, to achieve this objective. So first, you need the relevant stakeholders that can collect and present data objectively. And that is quite straightforward. I think in most countries you have Central Bureau of Statistics, and we were lucky enough to have on board with us from the start of the Central Bureau of Statistics. We have here my colleague Amit from the Central Bureau of Statistics of Israel, who's coordinating the whole process of well-being. So they were on board on this project from the start, and they could, of course, collect the data and present objectives. But we had to have two other kind of stakeholders with us on the team. And the first was a stakeholder that could interpret and the indicators and the trends. Now, usually, Central Bureau of Statistics don't like to interpret measures because they don't want to say if a trend is a negative one or good. It's negative or good. So we had to have some kind of body within the government that can interpret these measures and trends. And so we put on board both the Bank of Israel and the National Economic Council, both respected figures that could interpret these indicators and tell policymakers whether the trend is negative or positive. We also had to make sure that there will be respected bodies that can go in front of politicians, go in front of ministries, and say, listen, this is a bad trend, this is a good indicator, let's see how we enforce it when we do policies. So we had, again, from the start with us, the National Economic Council, which spearheaded this whole process, and the head of the Economic Council was very respected both by the Prime Minister, by the ministries, by the ministers themselves. So stakeholders was the first element. The second element is you need a political patron backing you through this whole process. And the reason you need a political patron because well-being indicators is essentially a paradigm shift. It's a paradigm shift from a perspective that economic perspective is the sole indicators for progress of a nation to a more comprehensive paradigm. So at the first government meeting we had on measuring well-being, our Prime Minister, Benjamin Netanyahu, which is on the right here, who is known to be a very conservative politician, said we only need two indicators in order to know if a country is progressing, as is GDP and GDP per capita. But our minister, our foreign minister, Gilad Erdan, who's left in this picture, who backed up this process from the start, had to stand in front of him, in front of the other ministers, and persuade them that this is an important initiative, that we should look at more indicators other than GDP in order to achieve better policy making. So the third element is ownership, another very important one. We had to have all ministries from all across the government with us on this process in order to make sure that after we finish to choose the indicators, they use them as outcome measures. So we did it through designing of the process. So we had, like the OECD, like in many other countries, we had 9 domains of well-being, and we put it as head of each domain a ministry. So for example, the Ministry of Education headed the education domain, same about environment and health, etc. Of course, in each domain there were other bodies, academics and NGO, etc., but the head of each domain was a guy from a ministry. So when we finished, after we chose the indicators, they couldn't back and say, take a step back and say, we don't know these indicators, because they actually chose them. So they could use them afterwards for their daily work. The fourth element is reporting. In our government resolution, we made sure that every year, the head of the Economic Council will report the progress about well-being in Israel in front of the government and tell them the trends. This was said in the government resolution, and ideally this kind of reporting should happen prior to budget allocation. In order to achieve short-term impact on policy making, you need to integrate the indicators into annual ministerial plans. And so I guess in Israel, like in many other countries, at the beginning of each year, the different ministries are making their annual planning for approval. And through this process of approving the annual plan, they were asked by the Prime Minister's office in the guidelines of preparing ministerial plan to relate their outcome measures to the well-being indicators. So this was another element in order to make these measures relevant for policymaking. So if our Ministry of Environment, when one of the well-being indicators is getting pollution down, we need to see how it relates to its annual ministerial plan. The last element is strategy. If you want to achieve a longer-term impact on policymaking, you need to integrate the well-being measures into the government strategic planning. So because we were lucky to have the Economic Council with us that sits in the Prime Minister's office and is responsible also for the strategic planning of the government, they are using the well-being indicators at 3 points through the government strategic planning. First, when they decide on the vision and the overarching goal. Then when they do the analysis and write the report of the state, basically. And the last, and not least, they also use these well-being indicators for measuring and assessing whether the strategic plans went the right direction. So again, the combination of the well-being indicators with the strategic planning of the indicators are crucial in order to achieve impact on policymaking. So in conclusion, 6 elements come to the word sport. So it's nice. You need to have stakeholders, a patron ownership, reporting, tactics, and strategy. And just last note, of course, this is an ongoing process. You need to refine it throughout the years. This is not a quick win, but in general, I think if you follow this step, you can achieve impact on policymaking. Thank you.
Thank you, Yuval. You have been very disciplined in terms of timing. Now I will ask Ulla Urström. She's working in the Prime Minister office in Finland, and in fact she's doing a little bit the same as Yuval. They're trying to really make well-being indicators and sustainability indicators relevant for policy making. And Ulla has a background in biology, and you have been working for long on these sustainability indicators. And now you are working more specifically for the government strategy secretariat. That means that you are drafting the strategic plan, action plan for the government. And if I well understand, the well-being aspect is really at the heart of this strategy. So could you tell us from your experience, what are the challenges in making these indicators policy relevant, and what do you think of the experience in Israel? Is it similar what you are trying to do in Finland and what they are doing in Israel?
Thank you, Matilda, and good morning to everyone. And I want to thank the organizers for letting me share some of our experiences here, and also for the really wonderful conference. It has really exceeded my expectations already, and I'll be taking home a lot of messages, and maybe something big will happen again, as it has happened before. And what I'm referring to is the Istanbul conference in 2007, because I wasn't there, but several other Finnish government officials were there, and they were so inspired by at that time we were talking about measuring progress, that they came back home to Finland and said that, oh, we definitely need to do this too. We need to have a new indicator set to do it, and that's how the Findicator.fi service was founded. I'm not going to talk about the Findicator much more, but those of you who don't know the Findicator.fi service, I urge for you to go and check it out from the internet. It's in 3 languages. It contains about 100 indicators, completely online, so they are updated immediately from statistical offices' statistical data when they are updated, and it's also other information from the society. So that is still running after 6 years of its launch, and the number of users are increasing. But perhaps this is one of the things that I want to talk about, is the use. We have a lot of users, but we don't know the impact of the use of those indicators. As Matilda said, I have a long history of working with indicators, starting already in the mid-90s with testing the United Nations Agenda 21 indicators, and I actually hope that now that we're talking about the SDG indicators, that some of the experiences from the 90s when we developed and tested those indicators, which never had much impact as far as I know, so some of those experiences would be taken on board. But in addition to those, in Finland I have worked with sustainable development indicators, environmental indicators, also taken in part a lot of international EU sustainable development indicators activities, for example, in the Nordic level. And it's always been this problem of, are they really used? What is the impact of those indicators? We've had wide stakeholder participation. We worked on different ways of presenting the indicators, worked on the timeliness, and the indicator is exactly what the timeliness is all about. But I feel that one thing we have still been missing, and it's the linking to the strategy, having the moment that the policymakers actually look at the indicators together. And this links to what we just heard from Israel, that it should be part of the strategy project process, and really the ownership of the users. So I was just listening to the words provide and tell, because I don't think that's what you need to do, actually, when we're really talking about politicians. And what I'm talking about mostly now is the government and actual ministers, the 14 ministers that sit in the government and are supposed to be doing evidence-based policy making. Of course, there is a trade-off. When you want their ownership and want them to be part of the indicators, maybe you can't set their agenda. So in fact, I am not developing indicators for them to use. They're actually setting the agenda themselves. So to go to the current situation in Finland, we have a new government, and they published their government program, strategic government program, in May. And I was pretty surprised that the government program states that this government will use indicators to evaluate their policies. And in fact, it also said that they're going to use OECD to help in that, in case, me and my colleagues don't succeed. Now, we've already actually used OECD to help us. But the fact is that the objectives are given. Our government program has 5 objectives, which are, and those objectives have clear targets, and they want indicators to measure those targets. So we can't actually, this is different from the other processes that we've had before. We are not going to have a process where we define first what the experts think it's important. No, the politicians have already said it. Of course, if we look at the government program, I can very easily identify many things that the civil servants we were doing last year in terms of foresight reports and we were really highlighting the big problems to the government, and they're actually in the government program, so that's not too worried that the things are not there. So the 5 major objectives are employment and competitiveness, I hate that word, knowledge and education, well-being and health, bioeconomy and clean solutions, and then digitalization, experimentation, and deregulation. So these are the 5 areas that we're supposed to develop the indicators for them to use. But before I go more into the indicator part, I still want to say, because this is quite interesting, the monitoring of this government program, because that's not done by the indicators. The indicators are to evaluate. This government actually plans to monitor how they are achieving these objectives. These objectives are actually broken down into 26 key projects. Our Prime Minister comes from the private sector, so I guess this is what explains that he has 26 key projects, and he wants to monitor whether those key projects are being implemented every 2 weeks. So every 2 weeks there is going, and has already been actually, a government session where all 14 ministers get together, no civil servants, no advisors. I've been there, my boss has been there, but not many more. And he wants an A4. So each each key project has like a traffic light circle, and if this project is running, we have really a project management tool for him where we have put every project is like step, what's supposed to happen when, and if it's not happening, the traffic light is red and it has to be explained. So that is the monitoring part, the implementation part, and then there is the evaluation part. Currently what we have done is we've consulted with experts and civil servants, but not really the wider public, because, again, the wider public was I suppose, consulted at the elections. So now we need to have develop these indicators, and we're also really basing on existing work. Already when the Findicator was developed, we looked at a lot of things internationally, so why reinvent the wheel all the time? I understand that we need to have some tailoring to the country-specific conditions, but we're also really using what already exists. So for these, and actually the other interesting is that we were given 25 indicators, max 30 indicators. So we really need to keep the number down because the government can't look at 100 indicators at one time, and I'm not going to make the mistake of telling them, giving them a report, because what is important is that they can take in the information, understand it, and have a common understanding about it. So we have at the moment, we have an initial list of indicators that the experts have worked with, and now it's in the political hands. So the political advisors of the ministers are looking at the indicators while I'm here in Mexico traveling, and I expect their comments by the end of the week. So far, what I've received looks that we're on the right track. But if and the idea is that the government, the ministers will get together at least twice a year to look at these indicators, with other information, of course. These indicators are not the only source of wisdom and information that we're going to have. So if my first kind of a take-home message is that you need a time and place where you look at the indicators, but in addition to the time and place, you have to actually talk about them and have the ministers really look at this. We've had these sessions before. We've actually taken the government to an island where they don't have to make decisions. They can really quite, in an informal manner, discuss the situation in Finland and really agree on it, more or less, because it's very difficult to implement your policy if you don't agree what is the situation. So that's what I hope that the indicators will also add to. But among the indicator, or in addition to the indicator information that we want to provide, the Prime Minister's office has a small 10 million euro yearly budget, which we commission very policy-relevant research from researchers, I suppose outside of Finland is possible too, because we do it with the tendering process. So those results should also, and those should be ex ante evaluations or otherwise evaluations of the policy. So those foresight information should also be provided. The other thing that I think, besides having the moment, using the indicators really together, the other important thing is really the presentation of the indicators. I have really been excited at this conference to see visualizations, infographics, because it really is for the politicians difficult, perhaps sometimes, not all can read graphs. Not all people can read graphs. I was actually slightly amused by in the previous panel, which started with, from the head of the Eurostat. He had this graph and saying that this is a very easy graph with the Human Development Index on one line and the ecological footprint on another one. And it took me a while to figure, okay, so that's where the dots, so that's not actually easy. So you have to really pay attention on how you present the information. Timeliness is still a problem. If I'm going to just provide an indicator graph on distribution, equality, something on in Finland, they're going to ask immediately, what is the situation now, where's it going to go? So I think it's important that when we actually provide these indicators, we provide in the same graph, same page, also some short expert advice or opinion on where are we right now, what is the nowcasting, the element of where we are now, shortly, and also a forecasting element, where are we going? Because the data that we have is probably from 2013, 2014. The government, the ministers, the politicians, of course, they want to know what is that they have done, what have they achieved, where are we going? One more aspect to this indicator thing, because I am, of course, aware that when we now only measure what they're asking us to measure, because I'm sure that will add on to their ownership, but there are many other important things that should be added. I was originally, before I came here, I was thinking that we should have a bonus indicator part, so we'll show them what they're asking, and then have something on a well-being index or happiness, life satisfaction, something that's generally is still really important, and maybe some international comparison. But of course, being here for the 3 days, listening to the discussions, I'm still one thing that I realized that will be important is the regional aspect, the local. And anyway, what I've been listening to here is it's quite obvious that on the local level, regional level, in the cities, it is much easier to get the indicators used and have the impact. But when you are in the national level, you use the national averages. You know, actually, at some point, I felt that the reason that statistics were kind of felt relevant or unreliable was that people couldn't really understand that why is the unemployment rate 7% when in my region it's 10. Like I feel that it's 10, somebody feels it's 3 because its regional differences are huge. So I think this is definitely something that we also have to work into these indicator presentations that we make. And also then the issues of trust, mental health, security, all these things that have been coming up here, I can't possibly have in my heart not to also show that information, but it's not going to be part of the official indicator set, but something that needs to be added. I'm still a little bit uneasy about not having a wider public participate directly in this indicator work, and I was challenged already by my Israeli colleagues about it yesterday, like why are you not having them in these indicators. I was also talking with Gus O'Donnell, and he was saying that, well, you guys have to publish the indicators somewhere. And then yesterday, as I was walking outside, I was thinking that what if we actually, because the indicators have to be ready more or less, like now or next week or November. But once they are ready, why not have them out on a platform and discuss it with the public? How do they interpret the indicators that we have actually chosen? What would be their message to the ministers when they get together? And then, of course, we could have also discuss, are these the right indicators to measure the objectives that are set? I mean, some of them are quite clear in terms of using more renewable energy, in terms of increasing use of biofuels in transport, but there are also some more tricky ones when it comes to the well-being and distribution and having available services. So I'm now thinking, thanks to this conference, that something like a more wider public consultation in terms of, but something that is very interesting, the outputs then to the ministers that should be done. So I feel like Enrico Giovanni, when he said that, he also came up with the idea of Wiki Progress just in one of these conferences, so I'm also now excited. So thank you. I hope this was enough for the start.
Okay, thank you, Ila. Thanks a lot. I suggest that now we have like 15 minutes of Q&A on the first two presentations.
Preguntas y respuestas en las dos presentaciones porque están relacionadas a este asunto fundamental de hacer que los indicadores de bienestar se usen en hacer las políticas. Tenemos algunas diferencias entre la experiencia israelí y la finlandesa.
So I will open the floor to the audience if you have comments or questions to the two first speakers.
Oh my God, I don't have my headphones.
Hola, buenos días. Me llamo Ismael Martínez.
My name is Daniel Martinez. I come from the National Institute of Public Health. I'd like to ask the two panelists, when indicators nationwide report an information that normally is aggregated or of some key processes, how do you do when, for example, in Finland, there is a stop sign or a red light? How do you make to deepen into that information? Because that information very aggregated or of a key process maybe it will give you more information, but when you have national results, how do you deepen if you have other results that support that analysis or that information to be able to know within that outcome what is failing? Thank you very much.
Some more questions? Do you have any more? Yes. Here.
Sí, claro. Muy buenas tardes, Noé Martín.
Afternoon, Noé Martinez from Monterrey. My question is, which are your best practices in terms of implementation of public policies, considering the issues of evaluation and also considering that in implementation it is when one comments that may emerge the greatest implications? Yo era el siguiente, ¿no?
Of Governments, Hartford, Connecticut. A comment and a question. In Minnesota, the state in the United States, I was involved with a public process with 10,000 people that went up to the governor's office. It lasted 4 years. New governor. So my question is about sustainability, because when you have a new administration in Israel or in Finland, that's all very nice, but many times the banker boxes are put in the truck the day after the administration goes away. So my question is about sustainability. So the issue of how do you sustain this from one government to the next? Because I think we have many, many, many projects like this that last the term of one government and then they disappear. I can give you a list of many. So that's my question.
I think we have already 3 interesting questions. We'll do a second round. So maybe you want to address some of these questions, Ulla?
Yeah, thank you. Firstly, there was a question about aggregating. So I assume that you understood that we're using indices or index, which we're actually not. I personally have always been quite hesitant about putting any apples and oranges together. I find it too difficult for me to do and difficult to read. And hence, we actually do have rather separate always indicators. So in that sense, there's no aggregation and no exactly for the reason that you said that then you can't know which one, you might have something going nicely or no changes, and in fact, something inside the index is going really bad and something's going really good. So we don't have that. And we don't actually, I'm not really planning to have any kind of traffic signs next to this specific indicator set. And it's actually not done with the Findicators either, because the Findicators are published by Statistical Office and they don't want to take stand on what is bad or not. What I do want to try to include is perhaps when you have the title of the indicator, you could already say there a little bit that is something, like give an idea if it's increasing or decreasing, if it's bad or not. And to the question of sustainability and longevity, well, luckily, I'm not a political person. I've been in the Prime Minister's office for 8 years. The Vindicator has sustained 6 years. It's a joint project between Prime Minister's office and Statistical Office in Finland. So it has been very much supported by, I think this is my 5th Prime Minister, so that part is okay. But on the other hand, what I'm saying, that the indicators that I'm talking about are actually specific to this government. So there is actually no reason we are evaluating their policy and their government program, and certainly after 4 years, if they last 4 years, and I trust they will. So it will be different, but I think what will last is this methodology that we're now learning. It will last, that we're going to develop the presentation methods, we're going to develop the infographics, the information that's in there. We're developing this whole method of getting the ministers together. We've done that before. It's still a different political parties in power, but they also think it's a good idea. They're actually, instead of 1 day, they were talking about 5 days in the midterm to look how the policies are going and evaluating them through different things. So these things will last. So I'm not too worried about that, but I know exactly what you mean.
Yeah.
Yuval, you want to take?
Yeah, I would like to address the issue of sustainability also, because it's a very important issue, especially in countries where administration change 2, 3, 4 years is a good situation. And first of all, a process that takes 4 years, a consultation process that takes 2 years is too much. We did a consultation process that took 4 months, and we did that in purpose. Of course, we lost a lot of, we didn't do it for 10,000 people, it was, I think, 2,000 people, but the fact that we did it in 4 months, we could move forward fastly and then get to politicians and to the ministries and not to waste too much time on that issue. The second issue is, of course, you need to make sure you always persuade the people in the higher level politician within your ministry to push forward for continuing these processes. So our process actually, one administration fell, and still they picked up this well-being initiative, and it stands for one administration at least. So that's hope that answers.
Yeah, thank you. I was just trying to think hard of the best practices of implementation of public policies, not exactly my field, but that was the question. And I'm actually thinking, because that's something I wanted to talk about a little bit before, because it came out in these days, is the silos, the horizontal cooperation. So more of a general answer, because these, what we're doing, the 26 projects, of our current government program. So those actually, there is a minister leading them, but often two, and they're very horizontal. So I wouldn't say that any of the things that, because we have to realize that even if some public policy is mainly for the health or well-being sector, certainly the Ministry of Education will have something to do with it, and also probably something in the economy. So I think that is it's a very good practice that we're doing right now as a one answer.
I think there was another question in the front. Yes. Where is the mic? The mic, please, in the front.
Sí. Sí, en
Edina, I come from the government of the state of Zacatecas, from the Secretariat of Economy. I think it is very important to evaluate ourselves and to measure ourselves in the government. And also, we've got a platform where we've got our indicators at the project level and agency level, and we have the stop sign. And also, there are things that lag in the platform, such as if we are in the red light, I think that we have to put the ideas to take so the policy improves. Maybe it's not working. What can you propose to us? Because yes, we undertake that a whole process of planning, which is tremendous. It is a process which is very extensive. We make strategic planning right now. We try to start the zero-based budget. Not even the Federation is undertaking it. I think we have to get inside, and we make the matrix of the logic framework and the matrix of result indicators. And yes, there is a platform, but we're missing. If we're not doing things well because we're in the red light, what are we going to do to improve? What can you tell us in this respect?
I'm not sure I understood the question, maybe because of the interpretation, I don't know.
Well, one thing I was thinking of that I think relates to what I understood from the interpretation was that when you evaluate that something has gone wrong, then what do you do? So I don't know, in Finland, actually, I keep talking about a government program, but actually the government program has been translated into an action plan, which Matilda talked about. And the action plan, yes, it is for 4 years, but it's very inherent that it will be changed. We will come back to this action plan every year, every spring, based on the evaluation that we do, which the indicators will be a small part of, but there will be, like I said, other information, another evidence to see how things are going. And then, of course, we're monitoring if the key projects are going. But we really have a very clear vision that absolutely, if those objectives are not being reached, the government will change the course of action that they're taking. There will be, you might have to come up with new tools, you have to change, because we're not reaching what we want, and of course there may be new things. The refugee crisis is not very strongly on our action plan right now, I'm sure. Things will have to be added next spring. At the latest, of course, things are being done already, but to have it formally. So I think flexibility is very important, and it has to be in the mindset of the politicians. Today, we can't have these 4-year plans or long plans. You have to be able to change the course when information tells you to do so. And that's what I'm so happy about, that it seems that we now have a government that it's willing to change its course when it's needed.
Thank you, Ulla. So I think now we will go to the second part of our panel discussion with the two other presentations that are related to very specific experiences, interesting experiences in getting some information about citizens' preferences in two different areas. So first we'll have a very interesting experience from New Zealand with Andrew Coleman and his colleague Joey Au from the Treasury. Andrew is also from the Economics Department of University of Otago. And they will show us how they have surveyed citizens to reflect somehow the diversity of citizens' preferences into their pension policy. You have the floor.
Thank you. I'd like to thank the organisers for inviting my co-author Joey O and me to this conference to present the results of some recent work that we're doing at the New Zealand Treasury. This work explores a method for incorporating information about the community's preferences over complex policy questions into direct policy advice to the government. The question that we addressed is quite specific. It concerns retirement income policy. But while I shall focus on the methodological approach we use, we will concentrate a lot on the specifics of what we did, so you can get a very clear picture of what this approach allows. This means that you may learn more about retirement income policy in New Zealand than you really want to know. In pursuing this project, we had three big questions. First, how can the government design policies that reflect citizens' preferences over complex, multi-dimensional policy outcomes? How do these programs reflect preferences over the well-being of current and future generations? And thirdly, how do they reflect the diversity of preferences within a population? Now, we can boil this down to two sub-questions. Can we rigorously estimate and measure the preferences of the public? And secondly, can we use these estimates to systematically analyze the relative merit of different policies to a diverse population? Well, our answer is yes and yes. The approach we use is a sophisticated multi-criteria decision-making survey which investigated the views of 1,000 New Zealand citizens about what they wanted from retirement income policy. And from doing this, we argue that it is possible to rigorously estimate and measure the preferences of the public and find out what they believe improves their well-being. Secondly, we can use these estimates to systematically analyze the relative merit of different policies to a diverse population. And thirdly, we can measure the willingness to adopt sustainable policies. So what is multi-criteria decision-making analysis? It's a set of techniques designed to help people and firms solve complex problems involving many different features or aspects. It stems from the operations research discipline and is increasingly used in the health, energy, and environment sectors. Kenneth Arrow, probably the greatest economist alive, has written a text on it. We use a specific form, a computer-based survey one of my colleagues at the University of Otago developed, a program called 1,000 Minds. This software helps people work out their preferences by decomposing complex problems into a series of simple steps. Respondents are typically asked to indicate their preferences about two scenarios, and these two scenarios have different combinations of only two aspects of a complicated choice. Each scenario has one high-level option from one choice and one low-level option from the other criteria, and so respondents are always being asked to make a trade-off. There's no free lunch here. I will show you how it works in a minute, but first some background about the retirement income policy. New Zealand is unique amongst the OECD by only having what we call a Tier 1 or universal government pension. It's funded out of government taxation. When you turn 65, everybody is entitled to the same amount, about 360 New Zealand dollars, and this is independent of how much tax they have ever paid. $360 is about 230 US dollars per week, or 3,500 peso. There's no means test. The scheme is very effective at eliminating poverty amongst older people. There's no compulsory savings scheme, although we have a voluntary subsidised savings scheme called KiwiSaver. It's funded mainly on a pay-as-you-go basis out of current taxes, and while the current taxes required to fund the scheme are quite low, about 5% of GDP, they're forecast to increase steeply as the population ages and increase by about another 5% of taxable income. So that's the background. How does the software work? Each person chooses a set of criteria, we've chosen a set of criteria of aspects of retirement income policy that affect well-being. The respondent then has to answer a set of 10 or 12 questions, like the question that's just behind you. So on the left of the screen, the person has to choose one of the left or the right sides of the screen. On the left of the screen, you are offered the choice of a pension that comes in at 67 years and involves no increase in taxes. On the right of the screen, you're offered a 65-year pension. However, taxes have to increase by 2 percentage points. So you have to work out what you like, and you click that you want the left or the right of the screen. And then the computer offers you another criteria. We have 7 criteria. Once this is chosen, here's a second question. And in this case, on the left, we ask, would you like to have no increase in taxes now, but the next generation has a 5 percentage point increase in taxes? Or would you like your taxes to go up by 2% and the next generation only have a 3% increase? People then make a response to this, and they get another question. The survey for each person finishes when the software has estimated the relative importance of the 7 criteria to each person. And the output is what we call a rank vector, which indicates the relative importance of the 7 criteria. So it looks like a number like that. 2, the first criteria, is the second most important thing. 6, the second criteria is the 6th most important thing, and so forth. There are 5,040 distinct combinations, and it's this basis that gives it its statistical rigor. How did we decide on the survey criteria? Well, first of all, we did a trial survey on public servants. That was very cheap, and we considered the fundamental objectives of retirement income policy. Then we had a series of in-depth focus groups so that we could listen to what people said was important to them. We listened to retired people, to young students, to Māori and Pacific Island minorities, to women, to public servants, to disabled people, and so forth. We had a desire to be relevant to the contemporary debates in New Zealand, and lastly, we got some expert advice on exactly how to frame the questions from a public survey company who actually provided with the representative sample. So these are the 7 criteria we looked at. 5 of them are about the current universal scheme. It's the size of the pension, when you get it, desirability of having it means tested or everybody gets the same amount independent of how much they've contributed, the willingness to increase current taxes and the willingness to increase taxes on the next generations. And then we had 2 others. We wanted to look at the desirability of a compulsory savings scheme, and so we asked about the importance of being able to save when and how you like, and we looked at the desirability of having much more wealth in retirement. Here's the exact questions, but I'll skip over them unless we need them later. Most people answered about 12 questions between 10 and 12 minutes, between 5 and 10 minutes. What's nice about the survey, it has a consistency test. Once you've done the 10 or 12 questions, the computer automatically asks you 2 more of the questions that you've previously answered, and we found that 80% of people answered these consistently. They really knew what they were thinking. And finally, we surveyed 1,300 people. We dropped the 20% of people who didn't provide consistent answers, and we just have over 1,000. So what about the results? In terms of the average, this is a graph of the relative importance of the 7 criteria. 1 means it's highest rank, and 7 means it's lowest rank. So what was the highest ranked thing amongst average New Zealanders? It's universality, everybody having the same pension. And the second highest ranked? It was not having steep increases on future generations of taxes. The least important thing in these 7 criteria was the importance of flexible saving. People were quite happy to have compulsion. But that's just the average. The beauty of this technique, it allows us to talk about diversity. So we can go through each of the criteria and look at how many people think it's really important or how many people don't think it's important. So here's our most important criteria, universality. 40% of the population said that not having a means test, everybody getting the same, is the most important criteria, followed by another 15% who wanted it the second most important thing. You can notice from the graph that hardly anyone thinks it's unimportant. A different type of shape is the importance of taxes. These are moderately important. They're not the most important thing, but they're not the least important thing. And you can see that from the orange line, more people think it's more important to have small taxes on future generations than they think it is to have small taxes on current generations. We found that having more pension is moderately good. It's not the most important thing, it's not the least important thing. Similarly, having more wealth in retirement, that's good too. It's not as important as having more income. Here's something that not many people think are important and lots of people think is unimportant. It's savings flexibility. People were quite happy to have compulsory savings. And lastly, we found one of our criteria for whom there's a lot of people who think it's most important that we keep the age at 65, and a lot of people who don't think it's important at all. So the community has been identified to be quite split on this. We can use this information to directly ask questions. Should we raise taxes now by 2 percentage points to prevent even steeper tax increases in the future? We found 65% of people of all ages, all incomes, all ethnicities said yes. We shouldn't impose very steep tax increases on future generations. Only 30% of people said no. This is clear evidence of a desire for intergenerationally neutral and sustainable policies. One of the things that we focus on with this technique is the diversity of views in the community. I said that we can match every person by a 7-digit ranking, and there are 5,000 of these. If everybody had the same, we can calculate a Spearman correlation coefficient, and it would be a 1. If everybody was different, it would be a 0. So we have a nice metric of how diverse people's opinions are. Our sample was 0.08, 8%. People have very diverse views. We can look at differences by different demographic groups. We found that there are differences between old people and young people, rich people and poor people, but in general, the differences are small. Okay, so here's a couple of examples. We found that people aged over 65 differ from those aged under 65 because they thought it was more important to have a high pension, it was more important to have wealth in retirement. They're more opposed to means testing. They'll be the ones suffering from it. They're less opposed to increasing current taxes, and they're less concerned to keep the age at 65. So this indicates some self-interest, although the differences are small. We found that people living in low-income households have a stronger preference for keeping the age at 65, possibly because they have manual jobs and they're less able to work after 65. They're more opposed to compulsion because they find flexibility very useful. They're less concerned about means testing. Again, some self-interest, but the differences were actually quite small, and we can measure them. They're statistically significant, but small. We can cluster people by the way they think using this technique. As we say in New Zealand, all people bleed red inside, but they think differently. And it turns out that the way they think is much different than the way they look or how old they are or how much they earn. We found 5 different cluster groups. I won't go into them, but one of them was people who liked the minimum government intervention. That was about 1/6 of the population. Another was a group that really liked quite a lot of redistribution. A third group were really quite happy with how things are, although they wouldn't mind a compulsory system. But one of the advantages of the technique is we can find out what the major groups in society are. Lastly, and this is potentially what is most interesting, is that we can then work out how each of our 1,000 survey respondents ranks different policies. We considered 3 policies. One we call pay-as-you-go 65, a continuation of the current scheme where you get a pension at 65 and it's funded from current taxes. A second one is pay-as-you-go 67, that raises the age by 2 years. That leads to lower taxes now and lower taxes in the future. And the third one is called Save-as-you-go 65. That means we raise taxes now to prevent steep taxes in the future by collecting the money and investing it, but we keep the age at 65. Each of these policies affects the 7 dimensions differently, and as policymakers, we go and work out how, say, Save-as-you-go 65 will affect current taxes and future taxes. We then use each of the 1,000 people's preference rankings that they have revealed by the way they've answered the survey to evaluate which of the 3 policies they like best. So we can rank the policies in terms of what people want. What are the results? Well, we found one policy that was very popular, most popular, amongst 57% of the people. It was their first choice, and it was not unpopular except for 16% of people. This is widely popular and not unpopular, and that was to raise taxes now, keep the age at 65, and invest the proceeds so that future taxes wouldn't have to increase very much. We found one policy that was widely unpopular. Only 55% of people said it was the worst policy, and only 16% said it was the best policy. That's raising the age from 65 to 67. And we found moderate support for the current policy. 27% of people said it was the best, and 28% it was the worst. But here we've got a technique which involves people evaluating policies in terms of what they want, what they think is important, and we can use that to discriminate between policies which aren't very good and which may be quite good, despite the wide dispersion of people's preferences. My time is up. To summarize, this technique and software seem very promising as ways to estimate people's preferences based on a willingness to make trade-offs. to estimate how different policies affect well-being using people's own preferences, not the preferences of politicians or the preferences of policymakers, as the well-being metric. It explicitly incorporates preference diversity into the framework, and it is able to capture intertemporal trade-offs and the willingness to adopt sustainable policies. Now, the key result from our actual survey, rather than the methodological approach, New Zealanders are opposed to policies that lead to high taxes on future generations, and 65% of them would accept a policy that raises taxes immediately by 2% if it were able to allow future taxes to increase by 3 percentage points rather than 5 percentage points. The paper is available on the New Zealand Treasury website. Thank you very much for your time.
Thank you, Andrew. I think it's a very impressive experience in informing policy making with citizen preferences. And now we'll have a second experience, a little bit similar to that, from Mexico, with Jose Franco, who is the General Coordinator of Science and Technology Advisory Forum. So you will show us what you are doing to kind of gather information on citizen preferences.
Thank you very much, Matilde. It's a pleasure to be here, and I'm going to be switching into Spanish. Okay. Muy bien, bueno, pues es un placer estar aquí con
Pleasure to be all with you. I'm going to speak about an experience, well, actually a couple of experiences that we've had from some years back associated to stimulate that the citizenry engages in the decision-making process, particularly in the decision-making process associated to science and technology. And the conference is empowering science and technology and innovation. All right. Education, as everybody knows,
as we all know, is the fundamental tool to build society. Both formal and informal education turns out to be very important, especially that is formal in terms of the life of the society, especially in countries such as Mexico, whose level of education is low. This turned out to be very important in terms of having programs that are oriented to raising knowledge within the population through non-formal programs. And they might be oriented in several directions: museums, theme parks, and use media and communication means to attain this goal.
Dentro de la
within the knowledge transfer of universities or experts to the society, science dissemination and its appropriation by society are important factors, and allowing the citizenship not only be enriched by receiving information from experts, but also receiving an input from the citizenship for all decision makers and experts is highly important. What we have done is seeing this scheme as a two-way scheme. On one hand, from the centers where knowledge is generated, disseminate this information to the citizenship, and on the other hand, receiving an input from society that would allow the knowledge formation centers to bestow information to centers such as CONACYT and the Congress with information that would allow them to redirect some of the public policies. So we built an exercise that we call the Citizen Agenda in Science, Technology, and Innovation. In this citizen agenda, we created a website where we put some information about 10 important and fundamental topics, not only for Mexico, but the entire world. We uploaded information and asked the society to tell us what are the 3 problems they consider as those of the paramount or most impactful importance to their communities. We had 10 challenges: water, climate change, education, energy, migration, mental health and addictions, public health, migration, environment, food security, among others. So from these 10 topics, the citizenship gave us a very clear indication. This was not a survey, it was just a checking out process. The website is open to anyone. All users were allowed, and they voted for the number of problems they desire in terms of scores from 1 to 3. The result was very important and representative because 150,000 people voted in 80 days, which were the days that the website was opened. The problem or the challenge that they consider as the most important to be resolved through science, technology, and innovation was education. Education was the most important challenge. Then we had challenges that were considered important, but not as important as before. And the difference between the first and the last place were not so significant. After education, we had water, environment, food safety, and energy. Then we had the remaining items we put on the website. The survey results were provided to CONACYT, and CONACYT used these results to build the program. This special program of science, technology, and innovation for the next 15 years. So the citizens' opinion was transmitted so that CONACYT made decision about what science, technology-related projects they should be focusing on and what projects needed budgeting and resources. We also composed 10 books that are synthetic, that are summarized, that provide options so that decision makers could use these books and the information within them and use it to make decisions. The works of this survey was not left in developing this work itself. The next step we started was creating a contest for higher education students. The first edition of this contest took place last year in 2014, and the contest consisted in asking any and all students from any higher education from any university to provide solutions to any of this challenge. We had 10 first places. We had one first place for each of the challenges. The prize was 50,000 pesos for the winners. And I must say that this was a very pleasant experience because irrespective of the number of projects we received surpassed the expectations we had, because in reality we didn't have a lot of expectations. It was the first time we have done this and we didn't know what to expect. But we received over 1,000 proposals from all the states in the country. You can see a map in the slide that indicating the number of proposals received from every state. And one of the questions that we consider as having a paramount importance is that big universities didn't get the first prizes. It was not UNAM, IPN, Tech de Monterrey, Ibero, any of it was the big prizes were awarded to intercultural universities, to technological universities, polytechnical universities, and technological institutes. These are a system of universities that are rooted down within the different communities in the country, and their curricula are focused to address specific problems in the region and engage with the production system in that same region. What this shows is that students from these universities are involved and engaged with the solution of the problems that are affecting their communities. We have conducted the same exercise this year. And as you can see in this graph, maybe you cannot see it because it's a little bit far, but you can see the distribution of proposal. But the proposal that received the greatest number of options was that related to environment. After environment, we had public health, and then climate change. After that, we had energy, water, etc. So environment is a topic that is evidently concerning to the new generations and students of universities. We can see a picture in the slides about the award ceremony. It was conducted in the Senate. Both the senators and deputies are involved in this process, as you can see. And on one side, considering the citizen agenda, we have reached out to CONACYT programs, and through this contest, we are providing information and inviting the Congress to know that education is not only important alone, but work in universities may become very important to address the problems experienced in the country. In this year, we have made the second edition of the contest, and we had a slight variation in the modality for proposals received. Last year, we received proposals that could be individual or in groups up to 3 people involved. In this year, we asked for proposals that were made in groups, composed by 3 to 5 students. An additional requirement was that the students were studying different majors. This represented a major challenge, but despite this, we received 895 proposals. The proposals are under assessment right now, and we expect that this exercise could allow us in the future to have a greater number of students from our universities become interested and be engaged not only in working in company innovation, but also working in social innovation, where knowledge has a direct impact in the community's well-being. Now I am presenting to you the proposal that we have received up to this moment, where evidently environment has been one of the most chosen topics among the students. We don't have the final assessment so far, but we expect it to be composed as of the last days of November. And I consider that exercises of this sort will become important to transform the country. Thank you very much for listening to me.
Thank you, Jose. So now we have 15 minutes left for Q&A session. You could ask questions, of course, first to the last 2 panelists on the New Zealand experience and the Mexican one, but also if you have further questions for the 2 first. Yes, over there.
Yes. Thank you. My name is Jamie Tangwe. I'm from the Vanuatu National Statistics Office. I had a question for Mr. Coleman and Mr. Au. I wanted to say thank you for your presentation, first of all. It's good to see sophisticated tools being developed that incorporate or that assess preferences. Just let me sit down here again because I need to read my notes. I had two questions actually. The first one being whether or not the 20%, you were able to profile the 20% that were dropped out of analysis. And the reason why I asked that is if you were able to learn from that and see why they were not able to provide consistent answers, and maybe in order to reduce the proportion that would be dropped from the next round or a similar type of work that you would be doing. I also wanted to ask if you included open-ended opportunities for open-ended questions to be asked or to open-ended responses to be provided for each of the 7 choices that they were to make, just in case they might have had a different option that might have been better for them, or any other mechanism for collecting their opinion without providing them with the choice. I do like that you provided them with the choice. I think that's the most effective way, but I also wanted to know if you offered any open-ended opportunities for them to express maybe a potential third option. I also wanted to know whether or not there was a communication plan for bringing the results back to dialogue, to public dialogue. If there was a mechanism for taking the results that you gathered from the research and bring it back to public dialogue for people to sort of discuss why the first choice was what it was in order to bring more political support for the decision that would ultimately be made with the results from that study. Thank you.
Do you want to do it? You do it first. Oh.
Okay. In terms of the first question, we thought there would be 2 types of people who weren't able to answer the survey consistently. The first were people who were just randomly answering the questions. And we can distinguish that because the order of the questions is completely random. And we have a way of estimating that they were about 10% of the total, or about half of that 20%. The other type of people we call good faith people, but who weren't able to answer the question properly. And so that's the other 10%. So we estimate that about 90% of people were answering the survey in good faith, and 80% of that 90% were actually able to answer consistently. One of the ways we can tell this is that we time the people for the surveys, and oftentimes the people who were answering randomly answered very, very quickly. So that was one of the ways. The survey has a lot of opportunity to answer responses. In fact, on every question you can put a response on what you really think or whether you don't think the question's very good, and people did take the opportunity to do that, so we did get feedback from that. The paper, as I say, is available on the public website, and so it is available for public discussion. It has gone to the government ministers and has been processed by there, but as yet I suspect the way to get greater engagement is in the next round for the ministers to tell us what topics they would like investigated, and then they will perhaps have greater commitment to the process. That's the P from patronage in our Israeli sports metric, I suspect.
Do you have any other questions?
I wonder if you'd be open to the idea of trying 2 waves of this experiment, one along the lines that you described, and another in which respondents were given something to read about the issues you were asking about. I think of my legislators as people who know more than I do, and I would rather many of them make the decisions on my behalf when I haven't taken the time to become informed. So it might be interesting to see what your response panel would say if they read a carefully constructed brief on each of the alternatives that you presented before them? What are the pros and cons as seen by the various partisan voices in your system? And would those results be substantially different?
We haven't done a second wave yet, but we are interested. The technology can be done in two ways. Firstly, we can do a survey on a representative sample, or secondly, we can put it on a public website and then anybody can do it. Obviously, we wanted representative samples, but a second way of going forth, and partly to look at framing issues, is to put it on a public website. I agree that careful reading would be very useful. On the other hand, we're trying to find out what people want, and we don't ask them necessarily what different policies can provide. So we like to sort of think about it like a car. We want to know what you want about a car, whether it goes very fast or it has very good fuel economy or is it red or yellow. The engineers tell you what type of car is physically possible. So that's sort of where the policymakers can come in. They can say, look, we can have these three types of policies, and this is what the effects of these policies should be. And I think we do that a lot better than the public can be expected to know. But we think that the public, if we get the right survey, should be able to tell us the equivalent. Well, look, I really want a car that has great brakes and can go from 0 to 60 miles an hour in 6 seconds. We don't want them to tell us, is that possible, but we want them to know, we want to know what they want. But I do take your point. If we could get them to sit down and read, that would be a very good experiment, and it's something that we can do.
Thank you. Is there any further questions in the front?
Sí, para Andrew. Los 150,000.
For Andrew, all those 150,000 of the voters, what are made of? Workers? But how can you be sure that the same person didn't respond that survey twice?
120 millones, entonces.
We have a population of 120 million, so 150,000 is a small portion of those millions. We put some barriers to prevent people voting twice or thrice, or have a robot that voted several times. We had the IP address for each computer logging into the web page. And when the same IP entered, we allowed him to vote 5 times, because one family in a household may be composed of 5 relatives. There wasn't any other way to know if it was the same person or different people within the same household or office. And to prevent, they used robots. Once that IP casted their votes, we used a timeout time of 3 to 5 minutes that prevented them to log in again. In this way, we prevented that a software was putting additional votes in their sake. I don't know if that answered your question.
We had a much smaller survey. We only surveyed just over 1,000 people, and we got a professional surveying company to do this, and the survey is truly representative of the New Zealand population. It's got the right number of women and men, the right number of people over 65, from 50 to 65, from 20 to 30. And it also splits by income, and the split by income, low-income workers, higher-income workers, workers with no income, follows what we know about the national averages. So it really is representative, and that's why we did it through a proper professional surveying company.
Are there any more questions to all the panelists, if you have second thoughts about the first row of presentations from Finland, Israel, New Zealand, Mexico. I think we had a very diverse representation of experiences. Otherwise, maybe we can come to a close of this panel. Thank you very much to all the panelists. I think we got very interesting experiences on how to make these well-being and sustainability indicators really used and useful in policy making, and how we have seen also with these experiences in New Zealand and Mexico that well-being preferences of citizens can be reflected, even though it's complex, it's not easy, but they can be reflected in real policy making. So thank you very much to all the panelists, and please join me to applaud them. And we are even on time, so thanks a lot.
Muy bien.